1780s was a crucial period in the United States of America. A new constitution was being drafted, and many of the major political leaders of the time were not present at the Constitutional Convention. Thomas Jefferson was one who was not at the Constitutional Convention. Jefferson really wanted a small federal government that would give more power to the states, and worried that a stronger federal government would take control of the country and become more like the British Parliament was. While away in France as an ambassador, he and James Madison exchanged letters regarding the Constitution and affairs in the United States. Madison had been sworn to secrecy and could not tell Jefferson much about the Constitution for many months. Once Madison could tell Jefferson about the government set up in the Constitution, Jefferson wrote back to Madison explaining his opinion on this new form of government. The two exchanged many letters regarding the contents of the Constitution. In Thomas Jefferson's letter to James Madison on December 20th, 1787, he explained to Madison the parts of the Constitution that he approved of, and also the parts of it that he felt were missing and should be added. After thanking Madison for disclosing parts of the Constitution to him, Jefferson discussed some of the affairs in America in the beginning of his letter. I am much pleased that the sale of Western lands is so successful. I hope they will absorb all of the certificates of our domestic debt speedily in the first place, and that then offered for cash they will do the same by our foreign one. Jefferson is glad that the sale of land in the Northwest Territory is successful. He had helped write the Ordinance of 1784, which divided the territory into separate districts, and the Ordinance of 1785 created a system of surveying and selling the land. Since the federal government cannot directly tax under the Articles of Confederation, selling land in the West was a profitable way to get money. The state and federal government still had enormous debt from the Revolutionary War, and Jefferson hoped that selling the land would quickly erase the money that they owed. If the federal government did not have any debt, then they would decrease their power, which was a step closer to the small government Jefferson wanted. Along with decreasing the size of the federal government, moving people westward would help create the agrarian vision that Jefferson had for the United States. People on the frontier would have to farm to provide for themselves, which Jefferson believed would teach them Republican virtues. Jefferson then went on to describe parts of the Constitution that appealed to him and his ideals for the I like the organization of the government into legislative, judiciary, and executive. I like the power given to legislator to levy taxes, and for that reason solely approve of the greater house being chosen by the people directly. For though I think a house chosen by them will be very illy qualified to legislate for the Union, for foreign nations, yet this evil does not weigh against the good of preserving inviolate the fundamental principle that the people are not to be taxed, but by representatives chosen immediately by themselves. I am captivated by the compromise of the opposite claims of the great and little states, of the latter to equal, and the former to proportional influence. I am much pleased, too, with the submission of the method of voting by persons, instead of that by voting by states. I like the negative given to the executive with a third of either house, though I should have liked it better had the judiciary been associated for that purpose or invested with a similar and separate power. In this section of the letter, Jefferson told Madison about several parts of the government that he particularly liked. The separation of the federal government into the legislative, judicial, and executive branches was one of the main parts that Jefferson approved of. Since the government would be split into three branches, there is less room for one branch to take control and become tyrannical. This was one of Jefferson's main concerns with having a strong federal government. Jefferson also liked that the legislative branch would now have the power to tax the states. Before, it was extremely difficult for the federal government to collect taxes because they could not force the states to pay them under the Articles of Confederation. Now that the legislative branch could tax, it would be easier to pay off the large debt the United States had. It was also very important that the legislator was elected directly by the people. This means that they had a first-hand say in the representatives who are in the Congress. If the people are unhappy with any taxes that the Congress passes, there is no one to blame because they elected the representatives themselves. Jefferson had witnessed the American Revolution, which showed how unhappy American people could get if they are not represented in their government. He then wrote about the disagreement that occurred between the small and large states about how they should be represented. Small states wanted equal representation, while the larger states wanted to be represented by population. This ended up being resolved by the Connecticut Plan, which created two houses: the House of Representatives that had representatives based on population, and the Senate, which had two representatives for each state. The power that the president has to veto any bill passed by Congress that he disliked also was an important part of the system of checks and balances. Many of the state legislators at the time had attained too much power, and Jefferson wanted to make sure that this did not happen in the federal government. By allowing the president to veto a bill, the legislature could not pass whatever laws they wanted to. However, he did want the judicial branch to be more involved in this process. After Jefferson discussed several components of the Constitution that he liked, there were still many parts that he disapproved of and thought would be harmful to the United States. I will now add what I do not like. First, the omission of a Bill of Rights providing clearly and without the aid of sophisms for freedom of religion, freedom of the press, protection against standing armies, restriction against monopolies, the eternal and unremitting force of the habeas corpus laws, and trials by jury in all matters of fact triable by the laws of the land and not by the laws of nations. It was a hard conclusion to say because there has been no uniformity among the states as to the cases triable by jury, because some have been so incautious as to abandon this mode of trial. Therefore, the more prudent states have been reduced to the same level of calamity. Let me add that a Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth, general or particular, and what no government should refuse or rest on inferences. The second feature I dislike and greatly dislike is the abandonment of every instance of the necessity of rotation in office, and most particularly in the case of the President. Experience concurs with reason in concluding that the first magistrate will always be re-elected if the Constitution permits it. He is then an officer for life. This once observed, it becomes of so much consequence to certain nations to have a friend or a foe at the head of our affairs that they will interfere with our money and with arms. There were several parts of the Constitution that Jefferson disliked or feared were missing. The main problem Jefferson had was that there was no Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights would protect the natural rights of all citizens of the United States. Jefferson described many rights that would be protected, including freedom of religion and of the press, protection from a standing army, and the right to habeas corpus and a trial by jury. Many people share Jefferson's concerns, which is why many of these ideas can be found in the Bill of Rights when it was added to the Constitution in 1791. Freedom of religion and the press is found in Amendment 1. Amendment 3 protects the people from having to quarter soldiers in their houses, and Amendment 6 gives the people the right to the trial by jury. Several of the states had already stopped trying cases by jury at the time, and Jefferson worried more states would follow. He believed that if a Bill of Rights was not added to the Constitution, the federal and state governments would eventually violate the rights of the citizens. The second problem that Jefferson had with the Constitution was that there was no limit for the number of times someone can be president. If there was not a maximum amount of years someone could be president, then they could continue to get elected and be president for life. Jefferson was concerned that someone who held power for a long time would become corrupt and threaten the Republican government. Jefferson believed that when someone holds power for a long period of time, they would do everything in their power to keep that power. A corrupt leader will then form alliances with other countries which would be detrimental to the economy and domestic affairs of the United States. Jefferson then ended his letter to Madison by discussing some current events in the United States and his thoughts on how he believes the government should be. The late rebellion in Massachusetts has given more alarm than I think it should have done. Calculate that one rebellion in 13 states in the course of 11 years is but one for each state in a century and a half. No country should be so long without one, nor will any degree of power in the hands of the government prevent insurrections. France, with all its despotism and 200,000 or 300,000 men always in arms, has had 3 insurrections in 3 years. I have been here in every one, which is great of numbers were engaged in Massachusetts, and a great deal of more blood was spilled. After all, it is my principle that the will of the majority should always prevail. If they approve the proposed convention in all its parts, I shall concur in it cheerfully in hopes that they will amend it whenever they shall find it wrong. I think our government will remain virtuous for many centuries as long as they are chiefly agricultural, and this will be as long as there shall be vacant lands in any part of America. The rebellion mentioned by Jefferson was Shays' Rebellion, which began in Massachusetts in 1786 and started in response to the high taxes that they had to pay. Many of the farmers could not afford the taxes, and farmers in Massachusetts thought it was especially unjust. Many leaders thought that the rebellion should be put down, but Jefferson said that they were overreacting. He believed that rebellion was a good thing, and that it was a way of allowing the people to communicate what they do not like about the government. According to Jefferson, the government should never try to stop or prevent rebellions from happening. Since Jefferson was living in France as an ambassador at the time, he was witnessing the beginning of the French Revolution. He saw firsthand how the people could communicate with the government and say what they wanted changed. Jefferson thought that there should be more of this in the United States, and that rebellions were not frequent enough. Jefferson then went back to discussing the Constitution. Even though he did not agree with everything that was said in the Constitution, if the majority of the people accepted it, he would as well. He then hoped that the changes he wanted would be added to the Constitution and that they will help the government become more prosperous. Along with his suggestions on what should be added, Jefferson anticipated that anything wrong with the Constitution would be changed as it was seen fit through the amendment process. As long as the government remained an agricultural country, Jefferson believed that the United States would remain successful for many years. This letter, written by Jefferson to Madison, helps to show insight into the beliefs of Jefferson during the late 1780s and into the 1790s. While the Constitution did not encompass all of Jefferson's beliefs, there were still many parts that he thought were appropriate. The government had created a much stronger federal government than Jefferson had hoped, and did not protect the natural rights of the citizens, but Jefferson was able to express his opinion to Madison and try to get changes made. Along with the Constitution, the French Revolution solidified how important it was for the government and the people to interact by means of rebellion. Many of Jefferson's thoughts in the letter to Madison were crucial in shaping the future of the United States government.